Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and in this video we move with William T. Sherman to California to try his hand at banking as he contemplates leaving the Army. Aboard the steamship destined for California, Sherman lounged in a deck chair and fell asleep. He was about a day away from San Francisco when he felt the ship receive a jolt, and the crash of furniture and equipment from around the ship filled the air. The steamship had hit a rock. Sherman helped to calm the other travelers who bolted out of their rooms. The ship had run aground. Sherman helped the ship's captain find the coordinates of the vessel and discovered they were about a mile from the shore. The people were ferried to the land, but before Sherman disembarked, he grabbed a can of crackers and sardines from the ship that was taken on water. Sherman and a young companion walked about 2 miles along the shore until they found a lumber boat destined for San Francisco. As they entered San Francisco Bay, a swell capsized the boat, and a passing ship had to rescue him. Sherman would wonder what the failed attempts at reaching the city meant for his future. When he entered the city, he found it much different than he left it. The city boasted 50,000 inhabitants, around 60 times larger than 5 years previous. It was a hub for gold seekers, and those looking to take advantage of those gold seekers. Saloons, restaurants, hotels, gambling halls, and other businesses lined the streets. Sherman saw the new growth as hopeful as he planned on making money and becoming financially successful in California. However, when he got to the bank he was to run, his hopefulness soured as he pored over their books. The bank was the leading bank in the town, but Sherman saw it as undercapitalized. He believed they could make more money if they were more invested into the bank. As he worried about his new business prospects, he had another asthma attack, fearing that he would be making a mistake by leaving the Army. Sherman traveled back to St. Louis by July 1853 to confront the owners about investing more capital in the bank. He got his wish. They compromised on investing $200,000 and reimbursing Sherman for all entertainment and travel expenses, which augmented his 1/8 partnership and his $5,000 salary a year. With the deal struck, he wrote to Ellen telling her that he would arrive in Lancaster and soon they together would go to California. He also resigned his commission in the Army, one of his biggest fears to date, but he was determined to become successful in California. When he got to Lancaster, the Ewings balked at the thought of their daughter moving so far away, but Sherman was determined to have his wife with him. But the Ewings were able to convince Ellen to leave one of their daughters, Minnie, behind. As the ship carrying the little family got to the Isthmus of Panama, their guide scared little Elizabeth, known as Lizzie, to the family, and Ellen's nurse became hysterical when traveling through the waist-high surf to get to the ship on the Pacific side. It was a rough trip for Sherman and Ellen. Sherman feeling as though everything was keeping him from California, and Ellen growing increasingly homesick as they got further away from Ohio. The homesickness didn't stop when they got to San Francisco. Ellen hated the city, especially its fleas and flies that roamed it. When she became pregnant again, she longed for home and even more, constantly thinking of Minnie in Lancaster. Sherman's asthma increased as well during this time, prompting Thomas Ewing to write to him saying that his health wasn't worth financial success and that he could still work for the Chauncey Salt Works if he wished. Sherman wrote back, "I would rather be at the head of the bank in San Francisco, a position I obtained by my own efforts, than to occupy any place open to me in Ohio." The bank and its new building progressed nicely. Sherman attempted to calm Ellen's anger toward the city by buying a piano, something she loved to play. In the evenings, Ellen would play and sing, while Sherman watched with Lizzie on his lap and danced with the baby to the music. The social life was great as the Shermans welcomed familiar faces and guests from around the world. General Ethan Allen Hitchcock made regular visits and brought his flute to play along with Ellen's piano playing. Sherman's old friend George Thomas, still in the Army, would come by to visit regularly. However, most of the time the family was miserable. Ellen's worries brought on a constant problem in her life, boils that would pop up on her body. Sherman's asthma attacks increased, and he would breathe in the fumes of burning niter paper to relieve the symptoms, but the smells gave Ellen headaches. The disgruntled wife would give birth to a son in June 1854. They named him William Ewing Sherman, but would call him Willie. His father would see him as a financial burden and something that would prevent him from gaining financial independence. Sherman wanted to live in St. Louis with a respectable income and own a farm outside the city. That was his ultimate dream. But as he said, his family was growing at an awful rate. As Bleeding Kansas began to take off during the Kansas-Nebraska Act controversy, Sherman wrote to his brother John Sherman, now a member of the House of Representatives. He advised his brother to support legislation that would help the Pacific Coast, and on the slavery issue he advised John to avoid the subject, but did say he believed slavery's introduction to Kansas and Nebraska was impractical. In February 1855, Sherman got one of the biggest scares of his life, a run on the bank. On board a ship docking in San Francisco Bay, someone declared that the Page and Bacon of St. Louis Bank had gone under. The investors and bank officers met, with Sherman joining them to discuss what to do. They wanted to sign a statement to be run in the newspaper stating that the bank was solvent because they had looked at the books. Sherman asked if anyone had actually looked at the books. None of them had, so he advised against signing any such statement. Sherman knew that his bank was solvent, but couldn't attest for the main branch and its other branches. He was confident in his ability to withstand a run. On February 23rd, droves of people lined the streets in front of Sherman's bank, wanting their deposits. Sherman told his tellers to calmly give back the deposits to anyone with correct credentials. At the end of the day, out of the nearly $400,000 in hard money, only $40,000 was left, but it was still afloat. Sherman had many of his old Army friends invest in the bank, like Don Carlos Buell, Braxton Bragg, John Bell Hood, George Thomas, Henry Halleck, and Joseph Hooker. That night, those that were still in the city affirmed to Sherman that they would keep their deposits in the bank to help keep it solvent. The next day, many people brought their deposits back, and the bank was safe. When Sherman returned home to Ellen, she told him to his face that she was disappointed that the bank hadn't failed, because if it had, she would be getting to go home to Lancaster. Sherman was deeply hurt that his wife wasn't more supportive of him and his great accomplishment. After the banking crisis, Sherman suffered one of the worst asthma attacks of his life, where he was confined to a bed for days. Ellen would leave for San Francisco, leaving her husband and 2 children behind to return to Ohio for an extended visit. She would be away from him for 7 months, but the two corresponded regularly. In those letters, she expressed a promise to give Sherman more affection in the future that she realized she had kept from him in the past. She feared that her absence would result in Sherman finding another woman to satisfy his needs, and that made her want to return to him even more. As a single parent in San Francisco, Sherman became a model parent, spending whatever time was left after his banking duties with his children. He doted on Willie in his letters to Ellen, making him out to be the best child a man could ask for, and describing with glee the little boy's destruction of his big sister's play tea parties. By December 1855, Ellen was back home, but her children had for the most part forgotten her, but she renewed her role of mother quickly. Sherman was climbing the social ladder, being named Grand Marshal in parades and then named Major General of California's militia. However, he would feel powerless in a social and political upheaval in the city. The city's elite had trouble getting elected. They constantly lost to those they believed politically corrupt. When James Carey, the editor of a newspaper, shot another editor named James King, the elite used the murder to help establish themselves in a position of power. They mobilized nearly 7,000 vigilantes to go into the jail and bring out Casey and another inmate and lynch them. Sherman attempted to do all he could to stop the mob, but was powerless. He, the mayor, and the governor watched as the mob exacted its revenge on Casey. After that, the vigilante mob began to subdue men whom their leaders deemed dangerous. The governor declared a state of insurrection, and Sherman called out the militia. The general of the U.S. Army in the area promised to arm the militia with weapons from the nearby U.S. Army arsenal, and back them up with a ship from David Farragut, the Navy commander in the area. However, the general went back on his promise, and Sherman was left with no way to enforce the rule of law. He would resign and work behind the scenes to end the violence and mob rule. By the end of 1856, Ellen would give birth to another child, a son named Thomas Ewing Sherman, who they would call Tommy. In early 1857, Sherman was notified that Page and Bacon would be closing their bank in California and put Sherman in charge of a new branch bank in New York. Ellen was thrilled to be heading back east, but Sherman was saddened by the news and blamed Ellen's extravagant spending on his inability to rise up financially. By mid-1857, Sherman was in New York preparing for the opening of the new branch. He had left his wife and children in Lancaster. While boarding in New York, he became friends with a young lieutenant named James McPherson. They stayed at the same boarding house and conversed on a multitude of topics. The conversations went into the night on many occasions. Sherman was depressed in New York, feeling as if he had failed in California and that Ellen had fostered his failure by not supporting him. He hated that he had built a house just for her, just to have her complain about it and their financial insecurity. He blamed Ellen for much of the California problems. While Sherman was in California, he received many deposits from old Army friends. Instead of just depositing them in the bank, he created a trust fund and put the deposits into investments. When the bank quickly closed, some of those men lost their deposits. He was under no obligation to repay these men their losses, but he felt it his duty to give these men back what they lost. While Sherman was in New York, the country experienced the Panic of 1857. Sherman was a meticulous bookkeeper, and his bank was solvent, but the home bank was not, and they closed down the new branch. Sherman was now out of a job, and he feared ending up like his father in debt and possibly leaving his family behind with financial burdens if something should happen to him. He returned to St. Louis to discuss the closures of the other branches with the other partners. Sherman was to go back to California and see to all the bank's obligations there as the last act of his tenure with the bank. But before he left St. Louis, he ran into another West Pointer who was down on his luck. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. Grant told Sherman about his farming failures, and they both agreed that the Army and West Point wasn't a good school for farmers and bankers.